All right, hello everyone, and welcome to our January meeting of the Oceanside Genealogy Club. Erin and I are very excited for our presenter this evening. Michael Brophy is a nationally known professional genealogical researcher, heir search specialist, and lecturer from the Boston area. He is currently the president of the Council for the Advancement of Forensic Genealogy. He was featured in the TV series Who Do You Think You Are? And the Irish TV series Dead Money, a genealogy show about heir searchers. And also something in his bio that I found interesting is that he is also a licensed private investigator in Massachusetts. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Mike. Welcome, and thank you for being here tonight.
Very good. Thank you, Jamie, and thank you for having me. Although I'm from Boston, I love New York. Let's get that out there to begin with. I love going down to New York City and can't wait to get there again because there's so much to do and so much fun to be had, very, very close to where you folks are in Oceanside. So our topic tonight is adoption research in America, history, genealogy, and the legacy of adoption in the country. And this one's close to my heart because I am an adopted father of a 15-year-old daughter. So this is something that I live every day. And my wife and I think, agree that this is absolutely the best thing that we've done in 20 some odd years that we've been married. And we don't agree on everything because we've been married for 20 some odd years, but this is something that we both agree on. Okay. So when it comes to searching for the adoptees in your family tree, the records, and that's what we do as genealogists, is we search for records relating to adoption. And the records have followed a very distinct pattern way back when, hundreds of years ago, even until recently, within the last 150 years or so. Records have been open and then they closed up again, and now they're on their way back to becoming open. And let me describe this in detail. Older Americans might remember some old norms in which adoption was kind of rare, that sudden pregnancies that occurred resulted in a quick shotgun marriage, as they say, or the mother was sent away quietly to a home for unwed mothers to give the child up for adoption. A child may have passed away. If a parent passed away, a child would be sent to live with grandparents, neighbors, some other relative, without a formal court proceeding. Things were, settled within the family. Adoption was very transparent. It was very informal. In urban areas like New York City, there were the orphan trains, which placed kids, orphaned and abandoned kids, into farms in the Midwest. That was a whole movement during the 19th century. And kids in urban areas were more likely left to fend for themselves, and negative stereotypes developed around adoption and adoptees. So in 1851, Massachusetts passed the first adoption law to protect the welfare of adopted children. And 24 other states quickly followed with their state laws. The records were not sealed during this act or during these acts of the late 1850s. A change occurred in 1972 in Minnesota, where the adoption community sort of changed their thinking and decided the integrity of the adoptive family was more important, and records would be closed, and that amended birth certificates would be issued with the adoptive parents listed as the parents on the birth certificate. And those original birth certificates would be sealed. Secrecy was to protect the child from the shame of an illegitimate birth, as it was thought, or unwanted intrusion from the birth mother. This practice went on into the 1920s and 30s of closing records, except for in the states of Kansas and Alaska, where they never acted. And we're on our way back here because 12 states now allow adoptees access to their original birth certificates or their court records, petitions and decrees for adoption. And this list, I've been giving this lecture for 4 or 5 years or so, And my old notes tell me that there were 7 states just several years ago. But because there's a movement going on in this country, all of the states that you see listed here allow some access to adoptees' original birth certificates or the court records. And most recently was the state of New York that you see listed there as your state, as well as mine in Massachusetts. Some general points about adoption is that 6 in 10 Americans have some sort of a personal attachment to adoption, meaning that a close family member or friend has been adopted, or as a child of an adopted person, or as an adoptive parent that I am. 2% of all the children in this country are adoptees. Most states regard these records as are only open to the adoptee under special circumstances, which we will talk about. And whenever you're doing adoption research, it's always great never to mention the A word in a courthouse, adoption, because even if the clerks sort of clam up, I've found, and will say privacy, 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 even when it's not the law in their particular state. All right. And certainly there's a debate in this country on the righteousness of giving out this information in public records. There's considerations for all, particularly if you happen to be a forensic genealogist like myself, and you might be commissioned to find a birth parent or an adoptee. There are powerful arguments on both sides, I believe, of the aisle for folks who want to keep these records suppressed and ones that want to keep it open. But certainly the general trend in the country is to have these records accessible to adoptees. Okay. I've got a short video here that I want to show, and this is called Vital Records. Right? For your genealogists, you all know what vital records are. And there's some great stories in this film about the impact of adoption, both legally and morally, as well as emotionally. And both sides are presented here, open versus closed adoptions. And there's great stories here from the triad, the adoption triad, which means the adoption triad is adopted persons like my daughter, birth parents who we have a relationship with, they're a state out in the Midwest, as well as adoptive parents, folks like my wife and I, right? And I believe that there are powerful, powerful voices in this film. And I'm not going to show the whole part of it, but I'm going to show the first 10 minutes of it and let you folks sort of decide and get your take on these arguments.
My name is Janet Allen. I was born in New Hampshire. I was adopted when I was 3 months old. I've never had access to my birth certificate. One day I was speaking up in the back of the hall behind me to a representative who had a great deal of power in the House. He kept calling me a child. He kept saying, well, you're a child and you cannot have your birth certificate. And I said, but I'm not a child, I'm an adult. And he put his finger out right in my face and he said, no, you are not.
Are deciding about my mother, adoptees' right to their own birth certificate. I really want to know what.
In some states, when a child was born illegitimately, bastard was stamped on their birth certificate, and that would follow them the rest of their life. In an effort to protect both birth mothers and adoptive children from some type of label following them through their life, the records were closed.
The records got more and more closed, and it was the adoptive parents and their attorneys who were the really primary movers in that direction.
My name is Tom Atwood. I am president of National Council for Adoption. I'm an adoptive father. This idea of mandatory openness can suggest that it's necessary, that a person needs to have this information in order to be a whole person. That undermines the idea of adoption.
I think it's a part of you, a part of your history that you're entitled to. It helps define who you are.
The adoptive family is adequate and more than adequate to satisfy the identity needs of the adopted child.
If somebody would ask me what are the rights of my kids, I would say they definitely have a right to know who they are. I think at a primal level, at a deep level, that's what all of us are wanting. We need to know who we are in order to function in this world.
Really over the rights of the birth mother's right to secrecy. I think it is so important for an adopted child to be able to know. I think the truth is really important all the way around.
Policies that unconditionally provide adopted persons access to identifying information upon reaching adulthood violate the principle of consent.
The only thing we want is our records, our heritage, to know who we are.
As far as older adoptees, say in their 60s or 70s, looking into their birth records, original birth records, really the answer is the same. I respect and empathize with their interests, but we need to have a policy based on consent.
I am 77 years old. I cannot see my birth record because my peers say it's sealed.
When a person has passed away, which you may guess is probably the case with the birth parents here, you still don't have the right to violate their right to privacy.
I'm an adoptee, born in 1916. For 35 years, I've been searching for my mother. You know, you just feel like you just have to have answers to your background.
If they, in their life, chose not to reveal their identity through a mutual consent registry, then to now, after their deaths, do so. It's like violating the last will and testament of that person, because clearly in their lives they chose not to.
How could she be registered? I mean, it's only in recent years that they've had these search groups or these registry groups or anything like that. So she would be alive.
Experience shows that mutual voluntary consent registries don't work well. They have very low match rates.
You sometimes hear in this debate that the mutual consent registries do not work.
One side doesn't know their original name. That creates problems. We make the assumption that adoptees know they're adopted. There are all kinds of flaws that come into play here.
Folks don't know which state to register in. Folks don't have accurate information.
And there's nothing worse than making a phone call and finding you're in the wrong place or getting transferred.
It's a very simple and easy process. And so the idea that is a sign that the registries don't work doesn't make sense.
Birth parents from a certain era feel that they don't have a right. They've given up a child and they want to know how the child is, but they don't have a right to take steps in that direction.
It's a voluntary registry, so people are voluntarily choosing to register or not to register. They work.
I asked her why she didn't sign up in a registry, so that when I had signed up, there could have been a match. And, you know, this woman is 70 years old now. And there's no way she even goes on a computer or knows anything about it or even feels like she should.
Well, that's a curious argument to me. Why would it be not working if someone is voluntarily deciding not to register?
I've found, at least the people that I've talked to, the birth family members I've talked to, is the hope that someday the child will make contact, that it's not their place to go looking. It's a silence based on love and concern, not on disinterest.
Healthcare professionals have known for a long time that diseases can run in families. Tracing the illnesses suffered by your parents, grandparents, and other blood relatives can help your doctor predict the disorders to which you may be at risk for and take action to keep you and your family healthy. That is why we're introducing the U.S. Surgeon General's Family History Initiative. This initiative focuses on a single, simple concept. Knowing your family's history can save your life.
Family history is important, but some might say this is hardly a news flash, and so why are we making a big deal out of it today? After all, genomic medicine has arrived in the company of images of DNA chips, serum proteomics, designer drugs, and so on. But none of that will eclipse the value of a simple, easily available, and totally free genomic medicine resource the personal family history.
What would be your advice to certain populations that would have trouble locating their family history, for instance, those who have been adopted?
Yeah, certainly when it comes to adoptees, I think this is a particularly significant challenge because, of course, that information is often not provided.
Amongst the arguments that advocates of mandatory openness present is the idea that adopted persons need this policy in order to have access to the medical records of their birth parents.
You know, I think adoptees deserve the right to be able to find out what their past is, their genealogical past, to find out what their medical history is and have access to timely updated medical information.
It is really unfortunate and indeed sad that individuals who have been adopted come away with frequently absolutely no information whatsoever about their family history, about their ethnicity, about anything.
Today, in fact, medical genetic testing, DNA testing, is able to provide persons, adopted persons, more complete information about their medical predispositions than the medical records of their birth parents.
There is no single genetic test or even a profile of genetic tests that allow an individual to retroactively determine or retrospectively determine what in fact their family might have been carrying.
Most genetic tests, whether it be for breast cancer or colon cancer or conditions like hemochromatosis, are pretty much predicated on whether or not there is a family history. There are very few such genetic tests that are offered to everyone.
In all 50 states, there are provisions made for adopted persons to request this information confidentially.
It's so disturbing to me when people say, well, you can get medical records. All you have to do is go to court and show you have medical need.
They found several lumps in my breasts. I was told that I had to send a letter to a judge, and I got a response from the judge's secretary essentially saying it wasn't a valid reason.
When they can show good cause, they can get it.
I've had every kind of an illness, open heart surgery, cancer, name it, and I've had it. The court approved my request, and when it got to Sacramento, the legal department in social services says no.
You simply ask the question through a confidential intermediary, and you can almost always get the answer from the birth parents if they're found by the intermediary.
My mother is almost 90 years old. Anybody that is against this either has no inkling what it feels like or has never been denied information that they need. If we had known anything about medical background, it could have saved a lot of suffering and a lot of heartache.
It's really important to know your family history if you are to secure your health, the health of your children, and indeed to save your life and the life of your children.
I think it would be criminal if and when I ever became a grandmother to think that my grandchildren would not have access to their medical records.
To deny adopted people the right to their own medical history, possibly putting at risk the lives of their children, is unconscionable.
Child and Family Services was against us because they perform a lot of adoptions, and they thought that this would hurt them in terms of their business. A number of lawyers who perform the adoption service. Adoption's a big business.
It was not an easy choice for Child and Family to make to oppose the bill. We thought that birth parents had been promised by the state that they could maintain the confidentiality.
There is nothing in that document that promises me confidentiality or anonymity. As a matter of fact, the document basically talks to protecting the adoptive parents and keeping, in effect, me from going back to, quote, molest my child.
The harm that can be done to individuals is too great. The violation of the right to privacy is too great.
One thing that doesn't make sense to me is that my privacy is more important than my child's sense of history or continuity about who he or she is. That doesn't make any sense to me. My privacy isn't more important than that.
I don't know why you need to protect a birth mother. If someone chooses privacy, then that can be respected at the point of contact.
It's hard to say. I mean, a piece of paper versus someone's privacy. I guess that's the balance that we have to draw.
You know, privacy is a funny business. It's a funny business because they didn't ask for it. Birth mothers did not ask for anonymity. They didn't ask for any of that.
But a significant handful of birth parents, especially 50, 60, 70-year-old birth parents, who have never told anybody in their lives that they had a child, and who are scared to death that their whole life will be thrown into an uproar.
I was thoroughly, I must say, frightened. This feeling of being found out. I didn't know how it would affect me, the family with whom I lived. What would they think of me? Would I still be someone important to them? Or would I be condemned for what I had done many years ago?
Nobody ever overcomes the feeling of giving up a child. It's just not acceptable in our civilization. The death of a child is much more understandable than the surrender by relinquishment. And birth mothers feel that they will be judged.
I decided that I must talk with her.
Oops. I hope you see how powerful that is and how powerful the arguments are on both sides of the ledger on this. If you want to watch the rest of this, it is on, oops, excuse me. There we go. It is on your handout. I did give a handout, and that's free on the internet on Vimeo, where you can watch the rest of that. But I do want to go on for the rest of the presentation. I hope you can appreciate the powerful and complicated arguments on all sides of the aisle on this one. That's what I wanted to communicate here. That I think those folks can communicate probably better than I can, to be quite honest with you. Okay, so let's get into the genealogy of things here. The pre-closure period. Okay, this is from before the Minnesota law came in and the rest of it. And how do we find our adoptive parents and birth families? Okay, certainly the census is great. If we're all experienced genealogists here, they will list relationships. The 1940 census, starting in the 1880 census up to the 1950 census. Certainly birth records from amended birth certificates, there's certainly a fight for access for it. And even places like hospital archives. Some hospitals in the area have archives, which can be helpful as well. And even things like in the newspapers, legal advertisements about termination of birth rights for the child of this birth person or that birth mother, that still goes on as well. And more newspapers are going on online as well. So for easy searching for names in areas where adoptions may have occurred, as well as court docket books. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Okay. The post-closure period, things like the court petitions, the adoptee can go to court, in the jurisdiction in which the person was adopted, and form a petition for the court showing good cause to see their original birth certificate or adoption records. Usually this is medical reasons for genetic testing. And I've found from practicing this for years, as they said in the movie film there, that most of the time it's denied in one way or another. Okay. 30 states do have mutual consent registries. That was mentioned in the film as well, in which the birth parents and adult adoptees, they can waive their confidentiality, register through an adoption agency or charity or an attorney who handled the adoption. And success rates, the studies that have been done in various states show that, as they mentioned in the film, that these mutual consent registries are very low. for a wide variety of reasons. There is this advent of DNA, which I believe has sort of forced the issue because more and more reunions are occurring between birth parents and their offspring because of DNA, with databases from, the big names out there. You know them all: 23andMe, Ancestry, MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA. And this is a matching game, right? In which we sort of match up the number of centimorgans that are from each of these particular people, and you go on and do your research from there. There are requests for non-identifying information. These requests can certainly occur when all other avenues fail. You can request medical information, names, addresses, phone numbers, birth dates, that sort of thing, are made through the adoption agency, the attorney, whoever handled the adoption. And lastly, there is modern records out there that are open. Things like probate, obituaries, states with open vital records, not New York or New Jersey, which are closed vital record states. Social media, one of the good things that social media can do. Obituaries, oral histories, things like directories, all kinds of stuff that is sort of modern in nature. Okay. So there are states that are either unrestricted in the work for original birth certificates, as well as petitions and decrees in probate court. A few states do that. New York is among them. Massachusetts recently became one. Those are the states that you see in green. The yellow ones are compromised, where they have some sort of a middle game, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, where they might allow some access, but not much. And the yellow ones, the red ones are restricted states, in which those states are closing original birth certificates and court records. All right. So just to give you some example of some information here, here's one from Cortland, New York. This is the 1930 census, that they list all kinds of relationships starting in the 1880 census. And you can see right down here that Carrie Dalton, it says AD.mother, that stands for adoptive mother of Lester Siebold, to the head of the household. That should certainly give us a clue when we're looking at relationships. Here's a birth certificate. This is the original birth certificate, some of which we might find on the internet, of Kay Johnson. I'm sorry, that is not the name of the child, but this is one from the Bureau of Vital Statistics in Texas. And this is one where the birth certificate does not have a name yet, but the mother is Tressie Belk, and her residence is the Corsicana Orphanage. So this should certainly give a clue. And it's funny, the father is acknowledged here as Roy Leeds. And this is certainly something that could be, useful for something just in 1922, with finding this on Ancestry.com, which perhaps the Oceanside Library has access to. I'm not sure. I'll talk to Aaron and Jamie about that. Here's a baptismal register. This is up my neck of the woods. This is in Boston, St. Joseph's Church, West End of Boston. And here's a baptism written in Latin for John C., born on the 21st of October, 1879. And over on the left corner there, you'll see the last name of McGill. John is the first name. And in the middle, it says ILLEG. That stands for illegitimate. And then you have the parents here of Anna McGill and the father of Patrick Protestant. All right, so again, a potentially useful record. Here's the probate index from Norfolk County, Massachusetts. And what we have here is an entry here for Mary Cecilia Conlin, adoption and change of name in 1867. And this is a workaround to try and gain access to these records, because these records are closed in Massachusetts to non-adoptees, even something from 150 years ago. But I went and got the probate book the docket book, as they call it, that talks about the entry here. And there's Mary Cecilia Collin of Somerville. And it describes in the docket book the petition for adoption, change of name, decree for adoption, change to Emily Clara Brainerd. So here we have an original name as well as a birth name, an adopted name as well as a birth name. And this might be all the information that you need for tracking down your adoptee in the Canton, Massachusetts registry in Norfolk County. Here's a database on good old family search. This is from Bergen County, New Jersey, probate records. And we have an entry here for Joan Louise Betts, the adoption with the docket book and the number of the case. And here on the bottom, we have all kinds of nice goodies and documents, petition for adoption, as well as order fixing date, as well as the decree. And it gives us name and page number, and perhaps we can head to the New Jersey State Archives down in Trenton and find the information here from the Surrogates Court, which is the court of jurisdiction for adoption in New Jersey. Here's one. This is the actual petition, and this is when you hit gold with adoption. And this was provided for me for an adoptive, a genealogy friend of mine regarding his father's adoption out in California, in the county of Alameda, up in the Bay Area. It says here, in the matter of Rodney Jean, and by the way, these boxes, I've put them in here because I don't know who's in my audience and I want to protect the privacy of these folks. But this is Arthur and Verona, and they're presenting their petition, praying for approval of the adoption of Rodney Jean. And they're appearing before the court. And this is Arthur, is the Ramage is the name, and Verona, his wife. And the second part of this document lists down here that it's in the county of Alameda. They've been united in marriage for 12 years and lived together as husband and wife. And on this day in 1921, said Rodney Jean was born out of wedlock to Nellie Louise Blank. Again, I'm the one doing the redacting here. These aren't redacted from the courts. 21st December 1921, Nellie Louise, the mother of said child, relinquished the child in the Children's Home Society of California Charitable Corporation for purposes of adoption. Lots of good information here if you can obtain this kind of a document through the processes that we've described. Here's one, again, for purposes of illustration. These are from some other states, right on Family Search. Here's one for Gerald Boyd in Calhoun County, Michigan, and there's the adoption with the docket books entries there as well. Okay. So I thought it would be useful to look at the laws and how they vary from state to state. I will include in New York, the great state of New York as well, but adoption law depends on the state. It is left up to the states as to how they want to allow the adoption community to access adoption records. So I figured we'd take a little trip around the country and do a little survey here on some states of interest. Here's the great state of Ohio. And Ohio is sort of a mixed state. They allow for some open access, but they've got this sort of three-tiered system out there where adoptions prior to 1964, adoptees can have unrestricted access to their file, which typically contains the adoption certificate and the adoption decree and petition. But from 1964 to 1996, there's access with redactions. You have to be 18 years of older. The birth parent can file a name redaction request, which will restrict the record unto itself. And in 1996, it's if the adoptee was born in 1996 or onwards, they can make the request, but the file will be only released if one or both parents have filed a denial of release form. So they're making it difficult to access these records in Ohio. Here's an example of one woman. This is the 1973 original birth certificate of Megan Collins. That's her adoptive name, under the second tier of Ohio's restricted system. And again, her birth name was Holly, and she wrote a moving essay on a website called bastardnation.com, called Black Boxes, because this is how she received her birth certificate, with all kinds of black boxes, and which refers to the black boxes you see that here on the birth certificate, in which she believed that the state of Ohio denied her existence. So Megan's meeting, she did find her birth parents with the help of a research assistant, and found out that her last name was Trexlar, and she found her birth mother. Megan's meeting with her birth mother did not go well, and she lost contact with her soon thereafter. And she does talk she wrote this great essay about her conception by way of a rapist. Great courage, I think, on the part of this young lady and what she did. And that's Megan. That's her picture. Let's go out to Iowa. Beautiful state out in the Midwest. Iowa, it's very subjective. This is where we go for good cause, for access, where we can petition a court order for good cause, which we all know how that turns out sometimes, right? But however, there's no good cause is required if the adoptee was born before the 4th of July in 1941. They do consent, they do maintain a mutual consent registry, the state does, but I couldn't find any statistics on the success of the numbers. A lot of these states aren't even going out and keeping track of the statistical numbers, but the ones that I found and researched back up what they mentioned in the film, the success rates of mutual consent registries are very low. So there are groups in closed record states, if that happens to be your area of interest, that are fighting for open adoption. And this is the Iowa Adoptee and Family Coalition. I found this on Facebook. They're fighting for a more open system over there in Iowa. And doing the research, I found a very interesting meme here that talks about access here. Imagine if every time you tried to get a government document about yourself, someone asked you if you are in good terms with your mother first. Adult adoptees are done with this spectacle. Just give us our birth certificate. So the way the law goes is that there are bills before the Iowa General Assembly to open up adoption records. These bill numbers may have changed within the last few years. The amendments add redaction options for birth parents, and not only for prior adoptions, but all adoptions moving forward. And a birth for parent's death doesn't eliminate these redactions in the case of Iowa. An entitled person, getting down to the last point here, is defined as the spouse of an adopted person or adult related to the adult person within the second degree of consanguinity. So that's a close relative. So this would allow a spouse, a sibling, parent, grandparent, child, a close relative to request the original birth certificate of an adopted person, even if that person is still alive. So it does seem a bit odd. It's sort of the equivalent of what's currently allowed for non-adoptive Iowans who wish to obtain, a person's birth certificate. Again, kind of a clean bill that put together all kinds of amendments and redactions that really don't make a lot of sense. So I certainly hope that Iowa is not your state of interest when it comes to adoption. Let's look at Rhode Island, a little bit more local. You can take a ferry, I think, from not far from Oceanside and get to Newport. Again, there's a recent change here that recently the state changed the law so that adults have unrestricted access to their original birth certificates, and they can get their birth certificate if they are over the age of 25. The state registry will not let you look behind the counter to search for anybody else's original birth certificate, no matter what the year. is access to probate open? My experience in one probate court, which you'll see in a second, tells me that they can be accessed to at least one courthouse in Providence. And adoptees have the right to access their decree of adoption along with their original birth certificate uncertified. So again, Rhode Island has opened things up. And again, there are mutual consent registries in there as well. And the way that they work is that each person can fill out a form that says either A, I would like to be contacted, B, I would prefer to be contacted only through an intermediary, or 3, I do not prefer any contact at this time at all. Right. So this just to give an example it's done through the Rhode Island Judiciary and Family Court. And the mutual consent registry is in the lower right-hand corner is the application for the mutual consent registry. This is one of 3 New England states that in my area of the country, along with Maine and New Hampshire, that has mutual consent registries. So when you click on that voluntary application, this is what the application looks like. And the search is done internally and a match is made. In which I did call the Rhode Island Registry and asked for success rates for signups, and they didn't have any results. They didn't even keep the statistics on their mutual consent registry for contact. Just to give you another example here, here's a petition in the state of Rhode Island in Providence, and this is regarding the adoption of Leon Francis. And once again, just to point out that I am doing the redacting on this. Respectfully represents Thomas of Providence and Marie Josephine, his wife. And the male child was born on June 26, 19 blank, and has resided with your petitioners since March of that particular year. And that Leonard, the father of said child and resident of X venue in Rhode Island, and Veronica, would like to change his name from Leon Francis to whatever. It doesn't say here on this as well. I should tell you that in a more formal modern adoption, you have to go to court, like my wife and I did many years ago, and formalize the adoption legally, even when the child is living with you. What my wife and I did was that we actually had social workers who came to our house and made sure that our place was livable for our child. We got her as an infant, and made sure that we were respectable people. We had background checks done on us so that we were not going to be ex-murderers or anything like that. And we had to go through classes to know how to swaddle a baby, to change diapers, that sort of thing. Be educated on proper cribs, things like that. That my wife and I had no experience with because we were not parents. And here's the decree. And here's where it says where there's Leonard J., the father, is the only person required by law to consent, has joined in the prayer for this petition for the adoption of Leon Francis. Kansas, a great state, and the name of one of my old favorite rock and roll bands from way back when. I'm showing my age. I'm over 50. But this is an unrestricted state for adoption as well as open original birth certificates, right? So what Kansas did is this is done upon request. Records in the state that were never sealed for adoptees over the age of 18, and they can get their original birth certificates. It's not open to other parties, which is for privacy's sake. Representatives of the Kansas Department of Children and Families can access these records at any time. And other people like you and I, when it comes to an adoption occurring in Kansas, are what I would call disinterested third parties and really don't have any business looking for those kinds of records within a certain time period, in my view. The law goes on to say that the Kansas Department of Children and Families can contact the adoptive adult at the request of the genetic parents for any reason. So the contact in the state of Kansas appears to encourage contact. And when I read the law on this, it was only about 4 paragraphs. It was very short and simple adoption law. And they just never saw the need to change it. So good for them. Talk a little bit about my home state, Massachusetts. Lots going on in the adoption community here. Here's the Massachusetts group, like the Iowa group before, Access Massachusetts. We had this sort of inexplicable donut hole law regarding original birth certificates. If in Massachusetts, if adoptees were born between 1974 and 2008, they were not able to obtain their original birth certificates except by court order. Adoptees before 1974 had unrestricted access to their birth certificates, as do those born after January 1, 2008, if they had reached the age, upon reaching the age of 18. So this is something that absolutely made no sense at all. And the Massachusetts state legislature actually closed this recently to make my home state of Massachusetts an open record state. And also, as far as probate goes, as I mentioned before, in my experience in Norfolk County, those records are closed. Okay, but there are certainly ways around it, like in the court docket books that I mentioned a few minutes ago. All right, we're on to the biggest and best right here. Let's talk about New York. All right, I believe that's a picture of the state Senate up there in Albany, ways up the road from you guys. New York is an unrestricted state, and this is the most recent big news in the adoption community. You folks picked a timely way to get this talk out, right? New York adult adoptees and their descendants can request and obtain certified copies of the adopted person's original birth certificate with no discriminatory restrictions. Okay, so the law allows a person adopted in New York but born outside the state to request identifying information that would normally appear, on an original birth certificate. Right. So the group in New York was called the New York Adoptees' Right Coalition, and they were instrumental in changing the law in New York, which was one of the most restrictive laws in the country, but now provides for adult adoptive people and their descendants the unrestricted right to request and obtain a certified copy of the adoptee's pre-adoption birth certificate, the original birth certificate. So court records in adoptions can release to the adopted person who was born in New York, but not adopted through a New York court. So direct descendants have that unrestricted right to the original birth certificate and can apply for a certified copy. And this all happened in 2020, is when the original access came, and this debate occurred up in Albany in 2019. Great timing too, just before the pandemic hit, when I think most state governments had other priorities around, maintaining and living through the pandemic. So I thought this was cool that that New York State voted overwhelmingly in favor of allowing original birth certificates in the 2019 vote of the state Senate, 140 to 6. Maybe you recognize the name of your representative on this list in the General Assembly. So, again, I think it's useful to kind of compare and contrast different states here, but I want to tell you about a story, an adoption journey for my cousin. This is my cousin Paul, who I grew up with, who was an adoptee. And he did his DNA test with the heading of "Where do I fit?" Which I thought in the subject line of the email on Ancestry.com, and I thought it was appropriate to describe his adoption journey and his search for his birth parents. Right? So this is Paul's original birth certificate from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. His birth mother, Lorraine, you see there on the right, gave birth, and she was incarcerated at the time at the Framingham Women's Prison there on minor charges. And they said that she would be set free if she gave up her child for adoption. I think that might be a bit of coercion, but that's the way it was back then. But my cousin Paul told me when he gave me permission to show these records that he feels like the system did him a favor by forcing the issue, so to speak, and getting Lorraine to my aunt and uncle, who gave him a better chance at a productive life. If you notice on this record here, it says changed to on that handwritten there. That's mentioning the change in the adopted surname to his new adoptive surname. It's on this original birth certificate. That's the state copy. Here's the local copy. This is from the town of Framingham, Massachusetts. And this is his amended birth certificate. His new name is Paul, and that's how I knew him growing up. He was born in 1963, born in Framingham, Massachusetts. And there's the name of his adoptive parents. That is my Aunt Dorothy, my mother's sister. And she's born in Boston. And there's the name of the father, Robert, my beloved late Uncle Bob, and my godfather, with his occupation and all that kind of good stuff. Here's Paul getting baptized. There's Robert and Dorothy, a child of Robert and Dorothy. Paul, he was born in Framingham, Mass, and he was baptized within the Catholic Church, within the rites of the Catholic Church in 1963. Here's a letter here, and again, the redacting here is being done by me to protect my cousin's privacy. Here's a letter from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to my aunt and uncle in 1964. Blow this up a little bit. And this is some information that may or may not be accessible. This is a summary of the information we have on your son, Paul. He was born on blank day in 1963, weighing 5 pounds, 3 ounces, 19 inches long. And he was described as a normal, healthy infant. So Paul has natural parents are of Roman Catholic faith, French, Irish descent, and baptized in the Catholic Church in 1964. So following the legal adoption of Paul in a year, you will be able to obtain a corrected copy of this certificate upon request. And the bottom part of this gives a physical description of my cousin. It says Paul's natural parents are described as mother's an attractive girl, 5'2". She weighs 118 pounds, brown hair, blue eyes, all kinds of great information here that my aunt and uncle got regarding Paul's adoption. All right, as well as him being evaluated by a psychologist and talking about his medical history down on the bottom here. Here's the decree. Again, you've seen these before, but here's Robert and Dorothy, my aunt and uncle. The Register of Probate. This is also happening in Norfolk County, Massachusetts, certified that Paul, with his new name that I knew him growing up, he was born in 1963 and adopted my aunt and uncle finalized the adoption in 1965, probably went through the same process that my wife and I did many years ago as well. So that is the golden document. That makes it all legal and all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. Here is the ancestry tree here that Paul gave me that he put up on Ancestry.com. There he is in the center, 1963 to living. There's his birth mother, Lorraine, 1939 to living. There's birth dad, 1941 to living. And Paul, you can see there, has a child, Julia. You're going to meet her in a second. That's her down the lower right-hand corner, as well as a son, Tyler, as well. Here's Paul's search for his family. Right? Massachusetts law at the time that he was doing this did not recognize the unrestricted right of all adoptees to obtain their original birth certificates. However, Paul was born in 1963, so he didn't fall within that donut hole between 1974 and 2008. So he was able to obtain his original birth certificate under Massachusetts law. And Paul was like most adoptees; he wanted to know what his origins were as he got older. And what because his birth mother was unmarried and she had an unusual surname, a simple premium search, white page search of her name and an address history found her living in the North Shore of Boston. So finding Lorraine was relatively easy. Lorraine did say that the bio dad, his name was Robert, and that's all that Paul had to go on. He did a DNA test on Ancestry.com, and he found a 2,199 centimorgan match, which is consistent with a half sibling from somebody named Amy, Amy being his half sibling. So Emily had a relationship with her bio father, Robert, and DNA testing of another known half sibling, born in 1963, confirmed the match to Robert, the birth father, who was living in Florida at the time. So after that, a relationship was formed with Lorraine, and she let it be known that she did have up 2 other children that she had born by 2 other men, one before Paul in 1958 and one after Paul in 1968. And I'm helping them look for one of them, the 1968 one. Hopefully we'll be able to find him. And he has a relationship with both of his 5 half siblings on both sides of his family. He's found some other folks. So there's Paul. There's cousin Paul on the right. There's Julia on the left. And there's the bio dad. Okay. My cousin Paul is a great guy. He's absolutely thriving now. He did have some youthful issues with booze, and he's been sober for 20 years now. And he runs marathons. He's crazy, running Berlin marathons in Tokyo, and something I would never be caught dead doing. His goal is he was recently training for the Berlin Marathon, and his goal is to do the 6 major marathons in the world, I guess. And he's done London, Chicago, and Tokyo right now for his marathons. Not bad for a guy who's in his late 50s. He works as a consultant in the biotech industry with an expertise in engineering and metrology, instrumentation. He owns houses on Cape Cod in Massachusetts as well as southeastern Massachusetts. I think he's one hell of an eligible bachelor. So that's Paul's story. All right. I want to finish up by talking a little bit about social media and tracking down your adoptive folks, the almighty social media, the problematic social media. This is a Facebook group that I found called Adoption Search and Reunion. This may not be the most private platform to use something like this, but this is run by a California private investigator. Again, for help or volunteer help in tracking down folks, this is maybe somebody to talk to, this Adoption Search and Reunion. It locates and reunites adoptees, birth parents, birth fathers, that sort of thing. I guess this is somebody who's a private investigator who specializes in this sort of work. I did find on Twitter this with the handle @adoption on Twitter, and it has tons of followers. This slide's a few years old, but as of March 2019, they were actively tweeting out news around the adoption community, like the great stuff that happened in New York a few years ago, as well as the more recent stuff in Massachusetts, in which our certificates were opened up. I looked at LinkedIn, not a lot on LinkedIn. I'm not a big Instagram or Snapchat guy. To me, that's for kids, younger generations as well. But if this is something that's interesting to you or your group, start your own group on one of these platforms. If you're passionate about adoption, then maybe that's a way that you can exercise that passion, because we all know how powerful social media is nowadays. So be sure and hashtag and gain followers and and be a leader. So that's what I have, folks. That's my presentation. And I see one thing in the chat there. I love questions.
I
Hopefully
am
the
just going to
answers.
stop the recording before we go on to questions.
Sure.
Okay.
I love questions, and hopefully the answers will be